Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the Singularity CE community call for November. We have a very interesting one this month with a nice demo of one of the features of Singularity CE 4.1 that's under development at the moment. So very shortly we'll be seeing Omer from Sylabs showing off the work that's been done to enable building from Docker files into OCI SIF images. So we'll get to that shortly. Before we do that, I just wanted to raise what I usually do, any releases which have happened since the last call. So here we are, 3 weeks ago, so not long after the last community call, we issued the first patch release for the Singularity CE 4 series. So this one is a patch release under the new features and functionality here. You'll see it adds a particular library to the list of libraries, which is bound into containers when you use the NV flag. And this is for support of upcoming versions of the NVIDIA driver. There are a couple of bug fixes on there. Unfortunately, the Singularity CE 4.0 release shipped with a bug where credentials stored locally weren't being used properly in some flows. So there's a bug fix for that. We also have a bug fix for build failures when you're trying to build a container using a Yum bootstrap on an old Enterprise Linux system. So if you're trying to use the Yum bootstrap on Enterprise Linux 7 with Singularity CE 4.0, you might hit an error, which should be fixed if you update to 4.01. And then the top bug fix entry here on this list, the one at the top there, this fixes a long-standing issue where some containers have var temp and temp inside the container file system symlinked either one way or the other. And Singularity didn't recognize symlinks, and it tried to bind both things in. So what you would end up with is, instead of temp being bound in, which is what you usually want, you'd have var temp overriding it if there was a symlink. And generally people want temp available in the container if they can only have one thing. So there's a fix for that issue. Any questions about any of this stuff before we get on to the exciting bit? Okay, well, without further ado, I'll pass over to Omer then, who, like I said, is going to demonstrate this Docker file to OCI build functionality.
Thanks, DT. I'm going to share a terminal screen that you should see 2 panes. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by showing a very simple Docker file on the right-hand side. And I'm going to start a build process here and then describe to you what you're actually seeing. So this demonstration is about building Singularity containers from Docker files directly. And in particular, it's about building OCI SIF images, which are part of what Singularity version 4 rolled out. And then running those, which I am not demonstrating yet on the screen here, running those resulting OCI SIF images on the OCI mode that went from experimental to fully supported and gained a bunch of new features, again, as part of Singularity 4. So this capability, as DT mentioned, is planned to be rolled out officially as part of, excuse me, Singularity 4.1. Currently, it's just in a development branch in an open PR. How does this work behind the scenes? Basically, the process looks for a running build kit daemon that's already running and that we have permissions to use. If it doesn't find one, it spawns a new one in a user namespace and uses that to build the image from the Docker file. That's important because, as you can see here, it allows us to run, I guess you don't see that necessarily, but it allows us to run this build process in user space. So I'm not running as root here. The way this works is by passing the OCI flag to the build that tells Singularity that you want to build an OCI CIF. And then in place of the argument where you would typically provide a singularity.def file, you instead provide the path to the Docker file. These two prompts are in the same working directory. Okay, so this has built for us an OCI CIF that should do nothing more than cat the contents of OS release. So let's see that that worked. There you go. So I am not running Alpine Linux here. This is a RHEL 9 system, but I built an OCI CIF from a very simple Docker file, and I've run it on the OCI mode in Singularity. Okay. One last thing, just to avoid distractions, you're going to see a -f flag on all these command lines. This just tells Singularity to replace the image file if it already exists. But if I've set up the demo correctly, that will never be an issue here. I should say also, if anyone has a question midway, just unmute yourself and speak up. I'm not at all averse to interruptions, but I probably won't see you because I have all my terminals open and so forth. So just speak up and say something. So, okay, this is a very simple Docker file. Let's see some slightly more sophisticated things that we can do. So one of the things that we've recently added to Singularity's native definition file syntax is the ability to pass in values into variables at build time. Now, this was inspired by a capability that has existed in Docker for a while. So given that we're now adding Dockerfile support, obviously, the obvious next step is to say, okay, well, can we pass variables in to Docker files that we build with Singularity? So here's a slightly more complicated, ever so slightly more complicated Docker file. I'll start the build while I describe what's going on here. It defines an argument to be passed in at build time. It echoes basically that value into a file. Remember, this portion of Docker files runs as root, so I can just put the file in the very root of the file system. And then once the image is built, what it runs, in this case, it'll both give me the OS release and cat the contents of this canary file. And what I've added here to the build, other than changing the file names for the image and for the Docker file, is basically the same CLI syntax that we introduced in Singularity 4 for using build time arguments in Singularity def files. So the same syntax here will work. Of course, with this being a Docker file, you have to remember to declare the argument. We're not changing Docker file syntax here. So if all works well, we should get that hello world concatenated again. How did it get here? It got here because we passed a build arg that was declared in the Docker file, put its contents in this canary file, and added catting that contents of that canary file as part of what the container does. I should point out, in case it's not self-evident, that this is a Singularity OCI CIF container for all intents and purposes, which means you could also shell into it. Now, of course, the contents of canary will not be catted onto std out because this command is ignored when you're just shelling in, but it's right here, and you can see that it's been populated. So shell run exec all work as you might expect, but for the remainder of this demo, I'll be using run so we can make use of command, or we could have made use of entry point directives in the Docker files. I hope that's clear. Okay, I'm gonna use Alpine for, I have used Alpine for the last 2 demonstrations now. Let's switch to a Ubuntu container. again, starting simple here. There'll be nothing new that you see here except that I'm switching to Ubuntu. No need to pass any buildards here. Now we can see that the contents of OS release are what you'd expect from Ubuntu. And now let's do something a little more involved. That is, let's use a Docker file based on Ubuntu that has a few things. It defines, again, an argument, but it also installs some packages. Okay, so this is like the cat of canary file that you saw a moment ago, except now we're going to pipe the output through some prettifying programs that had to be installed just to make sure that this all flows correctly together. So let's build this. Oops. Mistake in the argument order. So now you see there are a bit more steps taking place here. Obviously, apt-get update and apt-get install take a while to perform, but once they're done, we create the resulting OCI image, pack it into an OCI CIF. And now we have an OCI CIF that should be ready to go. In particular, it should say moo because that's what I passed in with the what to say argument that I defined. Crossing my fingers here. There we are. All right. Now for the grand finale. For now, let me show this. And we will build it. And I'll talk about it while it's building. So again, we're defining a what to say argument, and you've already seen this. We're putting it in a file. But now we're also going to try to pass in some command line arguments simply by defining a script inside the container, making it an executable, and defining it as an entry point. The way Docker files work now is that any command line arguments that you pass to the running of the container will be passed to this script that serves as the entry point. And furthermore, we're going to take some input from standard in and pipe that through the same prettifiers. So we should get three things being printed. First, the value that we got from the build argument, which in this case should be foobar, right? That's the what to say argument whose contents went here, and now we're catting that. So we should get from build arg foobar. From the command line, we should get whatever we pass. And then from stdin, we should get whatever we pipe in. So let's try this. I'm going to pipe in blah, and I'm going to pass these two arguments on the command line. Lo and behold, the container looks like it's fully hooked up to the things that we want. So we've seen a container that requires some install things, that creates a script, and then that we can pass build time arguments to, command line arguments to, and that we could just pipe into as a Singularity run, as you would expect from any Singularity container, but in this case, also working with a Singularity container that was built from a Docker file. I think that concludes my demo, unless there are questions about this. Let me stop my screen sharing for now. Okay, if anybody thinks of any questions they want to ask about this a little down the line, you can do so for the length of the current call. And additionally, as DT always reminds us, every one of these community calls has a topic on our GitHub discussions board. And so you can ask any questions pertaining to what you've just seen on there as well, and sort of have a discussion that the entire community can benefit from. DT, back to you.
Thanks very much. That's a great demo. Can you mention anything about what else is supported here? I think authentication is already wired up, isn't it?
Yes, so I didn't walk people through this, but all the options that are available as it is for Singularity to authenticate with Docker or OCI registries work here too. So that is goes from the auth file flag that we just added in 4.0, but also the interactive Docker login or authentication via environment variables. So I can show, I guess this will take probably not very long. So if you see my terminal again, we have here a private, an image that's sitting in a private repository. So without authentication, you wouldn't be able to pull it. So let's try first without authentication. I've logged out of my, at the Singularity level, I've logged out of Docker. So it should be unauthenticated to build this. Okay, so it tried to pull this image and we got an authorization failed. So I'm not gonna walk you through the every single option we have to authenticate to OCI registries. Our user guide goes through those in detail, but one of them is to have your credentials stored in a file. This is, sorry, I said we added this in 4. This is another one of the features that is planned to be added to 4.1, though unlike the Docker file, it's already on the main development branch. I misspoke. Auth file is coming in 4.1. So what does auth file do? I can just tell it, look, you can find the credentials for logging into this OCI repository here. Oops. I have to spell it right. All right, so now it's successfully pulled from the same URI that it wasn't able to pull from before. This flag is not restricted to this whole Dockerfile build framework. It's been added to builds from Singularity def files as well as other flows as well, but it's also wired up to this build framework from Docker files that we're working on, and that's what DT was mentioning.
Thanks. Okay, so does anyone have any questions about the Dockerfile build to the OCI SIF work? All right then, let me share my screen back on the agenda. So as we've mentioned, this is part of the feature set that make up our roadmap for 4.1. So you'll see that the auth file mentioned at the end there, that's checked off. That's so that you can specify an alternate file for OCI registry interactions. And then this point here, the build from Dockerfile to OCI SIF, you can see it's well advanced, although it's not merged yet. This initial PR, which implements what you've just seen, is probably going to get merged into the development branch sometime next week, perhaps, at which point you'll be able to try that out. Also in the works at the moment is the top point here, so multi-layer OCI SIF. Give a demo of this probably next month, but this should land also next week, and you'll be able to try it out. This is where you have a flag, a new flag, where you can keep the layers of an OCI image when you're pulling it from a registry into an OCI SIF, rather than squashing them all down into a single layer. You can keep all the layers separate in the OCI SIF file, and then if you pull down into an OCI SIF and you push back to a registry, you're not losing information. You still have all of those layers going both ways. And when the container is run from disk, Singularity in the OCI mode will assemble the layers into a container root file system in a similar manner as the other OCI runtimes do. So that's where we are. Those two landing hopefully, as I said, next week if we're lucky. And then we'll be moving on to also adding SCIF support in OCI mode. So that's the scientific file system where you can define multiple apps in a container and choose which you want to run. And the other point is further supporting fuse mounts in native mode. So stepping away from the OCI mode for a bit, this will be looking to allow you to use squash fuse and fuse 2FS in the native mode if you want to stop performing kernel-based mounts of squashfs file systems and extfs overlays and use fuse instead, whether that be in setuid mode where you would usually have a kernel thing, or the other modes that Singularity supports. So that's where we are on the 4.1 roadmap at present. We don't have anything else on the agenda other than the general kind of discussion, which we can open the floor. So I think it's been a really nice demo this month, and happy to try and answer any other questions you might have about anything SingularityCE related. Very quiet. Any questions at all? Okay, well, as Omar mentioned, and I mention each time, we have the GitHub discussions thread associated with the community call. So feel free to drop any questions in there. If you want to watch back any of the demo, it'll be posted to YouTube within the next day or so, and we'll put a link in the usual places. You can also pop into the Slack channel or use the Google group, or open a GitHub discussion thread if you have specific queries about what you've seen or anything else. So we'll end it there for this month, and we hope to see you next month. Thanks for joining us.